Africa. In investment brochures, it looks like a continent of hope. Shiny ports, modern railways, skyscrapers rising in cities that just yesterday were drowning in dust and chaos. The Belt and Road Initiative is presented here as a miracle of development. Big loans, big projects, big promises. But behind this facade, there is another world. A world of trash, debt, and toxins. A world you won't see in official reports or in speeches by Chinese or African politicians. It's the second dark side of the New Silk Road, the one people talk about in whispers, or don't talk about at all. On the outskirts of Accra, the capital of Ghana, lies Agbogbloshie, the largest e-waste dump in Africa. A place where children burn plastic cables to extract copper, and where black smoke hangs in the air, killing lungs faster than cigarettes. This is where containers from Europe and Asia end up, containers that are supposedly full of used equipment, but in reality carry digital junk. In the heart of Congo, Chinese excavators tear into the ground to extract cobalt, the metal the world needs in order to drive electric cars and charge its smartphones. But behind these batteries are children working in artisanal pits and rivers poisoned by chemicals. In Mozambique and Zambia stand bridges and power plants built with Chinese loans. Beautiful, monumental, and often empty. Debts grow faster than the traffic on the new roads. People ask, who is really winning here? Africa or Beijing? In Nigeria and Tanzania, Chinese goods are flooding the markets. Plastic shoes, phones, fabrics, cheap and accessible, but killing local industry. Instead of producing, Africa consumes. Instead of developing its own workshops, it becomes dependent on imports. In Ethiopia, dams and massive hydro-technical projects are changing the course of rivers. Pastures dry up, herders move on, entire communities disappear from the map. Modernization for some means ruin for others. These are stories that rarely make it to the front pages. And yet, they are the ones that will decide what Africa will really look like in 20-30 years. Because the New Silk Road is not only the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway or the Suez Canal under the Chinese magnifying glass. It is also Agbogbloshie, Congo's cobalt hell, Mozambique's debt-laden bridges, Nigeria's plastic markets, and Ethiopia's drying rivers. And that is what this episode will be about. It's not a story of hopes and grand plans, but of costs and risks, of the shadow that always falls behind the spotlight. Because if we want to understand how the Belt and Road Initiative works, we have to look also where no investment brochure leads, to dumps, into mines, into indebted cities, and onto dried-up pastures. Because the true price of globalization is not paid in Beijing, Washington, or Brussels, it is paid here, in Africa. Accra, the capital of Ghana, a city that tourist maps show through palm trees, beaches, and colonial forts. But a few kilometers from the center, there is another world, Agbogbloshie, a place that has nothing to do with glossy brochures. It is one of the most toxic e-waste dumps in the world. This is where equipment arrives that just a few years ago stood in our homes and offices. Old computers, TVs, fridges, printers. Containers come from Europe, the USA, but also from Asia, often labeled as used electronic equipment. On paper, they are supposed to help Africans in digital development. In reality, it is scrap nobody in the north wants anymore. Agbogbloshie is a digital graveyard. Mountains of motherboards, piles of monitors, tons of cables. Everywhere, children and young men, some disassembling equipment with screwdrivers, others smashing casings with stones. The worst job is recovering copper from cables. How do you do it? Very simply. You set fire to the plastic insulation and wait for it to burn away. What remains is a bare copper wire, a valuable raw material that can be sold to middlemen. But the smoke from burning plastic hangs over the whole dump. It eats into lungs, settles on clothes, enters the bloodstream. Soil and water are contaminated with heavy metals, lead, mercury, cadmium. Studies show that levels of toxins in the bodies of children from Agbogbloshie are several times higher than acceptable norms. Lung disease, skin problems, neurological disorders, that's everyday reality. And yet people work here, because there is no alternative. For a kilo of recovered copper, you can get the equivalent of a few dollars. It's often the only way to buy food. In this paradox lies the brutal logic of globalization. What for us is waste, for them is bread. And this is where the Chinese thread comes in, because ultimately, the copper, aluminium, and other metals recovered in Agbogbloshie do not stay in Ghana. Middlemen buy them up and they go to smelters, mainly in Asia and especially in China. There they get a second life. They become part of new cables, batteries, smartphones. The circle closes. Europe and America send scrap. Africa processes it at the cost of its health, and China makes money on recycling and the production of new devices. Agbogbloshie is therefore not just Ghana's local problem. It is a symbol of an entire system in which Africa becomes the world's dumping ground. And the Belt and Road Initiative, which officially talks about modernity, development, and investment, rests on this hidden foundation. Because every cable burned in Agbogbloshie is a brick in global trade in metals that flow along the same routes as containers full of Chinese smartphones. Let's imagine it as a map. From Accra, the raw materials go to ports, then by ship to Dubai or through Suez, onto Asia. They return as new phones or computers which in a few years will again end up in Agbogbloshie. It's a loop that is hard to escape. Agbogbloshie has already become a symbol mentioned in UN and environmental reports. But for thousands of people, it's just daily life. Smoke, heat, the stench of burning plastic, dark soil that will never again grow a healthy plant. For them, the future is just another container of e-waste. That's why Agbogbloshie is not only a local hell. It's a mirror in which the entire dark side of globalization is reflected. It shows that beneath the shiny surface of ports and railways, there is a world where someone pays the real price. And that price is health, life, and the environment. In the very heart of Africa lies a country so huge that its territory covers almost all of Western Europe. The Democratic Republic of Congo, a state full of green rainforests, rivers so wide they look like seas, and mountains under which the treasures of the modern world are hidden. This is where more than 2/3 of the world's cobalt reserves are found, a metal without which not a single smartphone, laptop, or electric car would work. Cobalt has become the oil of the 21st century. Thanks to it, the batteries in our phones charge in a few hours, and electric cars can travel hundreds of kilometers. Anyone talking about green transition, clean energy, and a future without fossil fuels is, in reality, talking about Congo. Because without Congolese cobalt, that entire dream is impossible. But under that dream lies a nightmare. In the provinces of Katanga and Lualaba, hundreds of thousands of people go every day into artisanal mines, narrow, primitive holes in the ground, often without any safety measures. The narrow tunnels collapse on miners' heads, and rivers around the mines are poisoned with toxins. There are no protective masks, no ventilation, no insurance. There are only shovels, buckets, and children who often work alongside adults. The Western world prefers not to remember this. It's easier to talk about clean energy and electromobility when you don't think about the fact that behind every battery stands a Congolese child digging with bare hands in the earth. The Chinese saw Congo's potential much earlier than others. Today, most of the largest cobalt mines are controlled by Chinese consortia. They took them over in exchange for loans, for investments in roads and power lines, for agreements that meant a quick injection of cash for local authorities and full control over a strategic raw material for Beijing. Officially, it's a partnership for development. In reality, economic subjugation. Because cobalt from Congo flows almost entirely east, it goes to smelters and refineries in China, where it is purified and prepared for battery production. From there, it goes to factories of Tesla, Apple, Samsung, and hundreds of other companies that could not exist without this raw material. Congo is thus the source of the entire digital and energy revolution, and yet gains the least from it. For people living around the mines, life oscillates between work and illness. Contaminated water causes deformities and miscarriages. Cobalt dust settles in lungs, leading to irreversible damage. Families risk their lives because a few dollars a day is still better than hunger. And here the bigger picture appears. Congo is not a lonely island. Cobalt from its mines feeds into global supply chains that run through the Middle East ships Carrying this raw material passed through ports in Djibouti, across the Red Sea, through Suez. Containers filled with ore passed tankers carrying oil from Arabia and gas carriers from Qatar. Everything comes together in one bloodstream, the global trading system in which Africa provides the veins and nerves while the Middle East becomes the heart of transport. Congo is a dramatic proof that behind every new smartphone and every new electric car is someone suffering. It's a place that tells us the green revolution in the north is built on the black hell of the south. And when politicians in Brussels, Washington, or Beijing talk about climate neutrality, in Congo it means children breathing cobalt dust and people dying underground. Here lies the biggest paradox. Cobalt is supposed to save the planet from climate catastrophe, but for hundreds of thousands of Congo's residents, it already is a personal catastrophe. The metal of the future has become a metal of blood. And that is why, when we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, we cannot look only at shiny trains and ports. We also have to look at the mines of Katanga, because it is there, in the artisanal pits, that the future of our batteries begins, and above them hang not only clouds of dust and smoke, but also a question. Will the world ever count the true cost of its transformation? When people talk about the Belt and Road Initiative in Africa, they most often show images of new bridges, wide highways, and power plants rising on the horizon. Images meant to convince us that Africa is entering a new era, an era of modernization and development. But if we go deeper, we see the other side of the story. The side where those same bridges become a burden and the roads a symbol of debt. Mozambique was supposed to be a success story. In Maputo, the country's capital, the Maputo-Katembe Bridge was built. The longest in Africa, linking the two banks of Maputo Bay. The investment cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and at the opening, politicians spoke of a gateway to the future. The problem is that traffic on the bridge is minimal. Most residents can't afford the tolls, and the link it was supposed to make easier is still out of reach for thousands of people. The bridge stands there, beautiful and modern, but more as a monument to a Chinese loan than as a real change in everyday life. The same story in Zambia. There, Chinese companies built roads and power lines, financed by loans from Beijing. The government took on more and more loans, hoping that economic growth would make it possible to pay them back. But the economy didn't grow fast enough, and the price of copper, the country's main export commodity, started to fall. Debts rose, and the repayments became so high that Zambia found itself on the brink of bankruptcy. There was a very real risk that in exchange for unpaid loans, Beijing would take control of strategic assets, ports, railway lines, even mines. That's how the debt trap works. At the beginning, there is hope that the loan is a step towards the future. Politicians boast about new investments. People see highways and bridges that seemed unattainable just a few years ago. But when it's time to pay up, it turns out the price is higher than anyone expected. Mozambique and Zambia are not exceptions. Across Africa, we can find similar stories. Airports with only a few flights a month, stadiums built on credit that stand empty, power plants running at half-capacity ghost projects that were supposed to be symbols of development and instead became symbols of debt. And here we get to the core. The Chinese strategy is not really about every project paying off immediately. Sometimes it's quite the opposite. What matters is that the country gets so indebted that it has no way out. It has to give Beijing access to its resources or its infrastructure. Then even an empty highway makes sense because it becomes a tool of political pressure. For ordinary people, this game means one thing: rising taxes, cuts in spending on health and education, higher cost of living, bridges and roads that were meant to change everyday life, become a reminder of a debt that may take generations to pay off. And all of this leads back to the Middle East. Indebted African countries often pay back part of their loans not in cash, but in raw materials and export contracts. Copper from Zambia flows through ports in Dar es Salaam and on through the Red Sea. Gas from Mozambique goes on to ships that pass the coasts of Yemen and Saudi Arabia. Every shipment of goods is at the same time a debt repayment. So the debt trap is not only about a country having no money, it's about losing sovereignty. Instead of deciding its own future, it starts playing by rules set by the creditor. And in Africa's case, that creditor is increasingly China. That's why the bridge in Maputo and debt-ridden Zambia are not just local stories. They are elements of a global strategy in which credit becomes a tool of influence, and influence that stretches far beyond Africa, all the way to the Middle East, where the same ships transporting raw materials and goods become part of a game about the future of entire regions. Nigeria is a giant. The largest economy in Africa, more than 200 million people, cities like Lagos, pulsing with energy and chaos, at the same time a country that could be the engine of the entire continent. But Nigeria is also an example of how Chinese expansion works in the world of mass consumption. From highways and railways to plastic sandals on street markets, Lagos is a living organism, a city that never sleeps, where traffic goes on 24/7 and markets are so vast they look like anthills. It is here that you can see China's presence most clearly. Along the streets stand stalls full of cheap phones, watches, fabrics, and electronics. Plastic baskets are piled high with sandals and flip-flops that look as though they might fall apart after a few days of use. Vendors praise the goods, shouting that it's good quality, but everyone knows that's fiction. People buy because the prices are so low that even the poorest can afford something. Chinese factories have flooded Nigeria with goods that have become part of everyday life. Phones worth a few dollars, breaking after a month but allowing people to make calls and send messages for the first time. Clothes that resemble branded items but are in reality only cheap fakes. Shoes that fall apart on the pavement but let children go to school not barefoot. It's a revolution of daily life. Cheap, accessible, but paid for with the collapse of local industry. Nigeria once had its own workshops, its own factories, its own sewing rooms, but mass imports from China destroyed most of them. Local producers could not compete with the prices of Chinese goods. Even if the quality was dramatically low, price was what mattered, and price always won. You can see this process everywhere. In Lagos, next to modern projects such as the Chinese-built Lagos-Ibadan Railway or the new bridge over the lagoon, you see markets drowning in plastic trash. Mega investments for governments and elites go hand in hand with a flood of cheap goods for ordinary people. Two faces of the same mechanism. Plastic shoes and marketplace phones are part of a bigger strategy. Chinese factories in Nigeria and neighboring countries often produce two versions of the same product at the same time. One, for the local market, the cheapest possible, made of plastic, cardboard, waste. The other, for export, for Europe and America, of decent quality. Nigeria becomes a testing ground where cheapness matters more than durability, and Western markets use the same infrastructure, but at a different standard. Lagos lives with this paradox. On the one hand, railways, highways, and power plants built on credit by Chinese firms. On the other, markets full of junk that lets people survive the day but offers no future. And in both cases, Nigeria is becoming ever more dependent on Beijing, whether through debt or through consumption. What happens in Lagos markets has a global dimension. Plastic sandals and cheap phones also become part of the Belt and Road. They travel in containers through ports, through Dubai, through Suez. They are transported on the same ships as oil from Nigeria and cobalt from Congo. It's one and the same system, from luxury infrastructure projects down to the cheapest everyday goods. Nigeria shows us, in the most brutal way, that the Belt and Road Initiative is not just about big contracts and billions of dollars. It is also about plastic goods that change the daily lives of millions. They offer a semblance of modernity while taking away the chance to build genuine economic independence. Because if even in a country as big as Nigeria, children go to school in plastic shoes from Chinese factories, not in local products, it means the system has worked. But it has worked in a way that creates dependency instead of liberation. Ethiopia is a country with a remarkable history. One of the oldest states in the world, the only one in Africa that was never colonized. A land of mountains, volcanoes, and fertile valleys where ancient civilizations were born. But modern Ethiopia is also a battlefield over modernity, with water as the main stake, the most important resource of the 21st century. The Omo River is one of the great arteries of southern Ethiopia. Its waters have given life for thousands of years to pastoralist tribes who drove their herds along its banks. There existed a world that changed slowly, according to the rhythm of nature, until giant hydrotechnical projects appeared on the horizon. Chinese construction companies, the same ones building skyscrapers in Addis Ababa or ports in Tanzania, got contracts to build dams. Gaib III and subsequent projects are constructions on a scale Ethiopia has never seen before. Massive concrete walls stop the water, creating artificial lakes that were supposed to supply electricity to millions and irrigate huge agricultural fields. On paper, it looked like a triumph of modernity. Electricity that Ethiopia so badly needed was to flow in abundance. Fields of cotton and sugarcane were to turn the south of the country into green plantations, and the country was meant to start exporting surplus energy to its neighbors. This was supposed to be an investment that would make Ethiopia independent and allow it to become a regional leader. But the price was enormous. The Omo River stopped flowing the way it always had. Seasonal floods that irrigated pastures and fields were stopped. The Mercy, Karo, and Nyangatom tribes lost their land. Cattle that had been wealth and pride for generations began to die of hunger because there was no grass. People were forced to migrate, and those who stayed faced hunger and poverty. The construction of dams on the Omo shows a brutal paradox. Some gain, the residents of Addis Ababa, who get electricity in their homes, factories that can produce for export. Others lose, people whose lives were tied to the river and its natural rhythm. They paid the real price of modernity. In the background stands Beijing, of course. Chinese firms built the dams, Chinese loans financed the mega project. Officially, this is a partnership. In practice, another dependency. Ethiopia not only has to pay back billions of dollars in debt, but also gives up part of the revenues from energy into foreign hands. The consequences go far beyond Ethiopia itself. Blocking the waters of the Omo also means changes in Kenya, where the river flows into Lake Turkana. This largest desert lake in the world has started to shrink. Hundreds of thousands of people on the other side of the border have also lost access to water. Conflicts over land and pastures have become even more intense. This is how the logic of large-scale projects works. When you look at a satellite photo, you see a huge reservoir and a dam supplying electricity. When you go down to ground level, you see malnourished children, herds dead from hunger, and tribes losing their world. Two images of the same reality: modernity and its cost. Ethiopia is a symbol of a broader process. Dams on the Omo are not an exception. Across Africa and the Middle East, similar projects are being built, often by the same Chinese companies. Each of them brings electricity and farmland, but at the same time destroys the old order. Each of them shows that progress for some is often tragedy for others. Agbogbloshi, Congo, Mozambique, Nigeria, Ethiopia. 5 places, 5 stories that at first glance have nothing in common. One is an e-waste dump, another, cobalt mines, yet another, indebted bridges, plastic markets, or a dam on a river. And yet they all weave together into one picture. The picture of a continent that has become a testing ground for globalization. In Ghana, children breathe black smoke from burning cables to recover copper. In Congo, boys descend into artisanal pits to dig cobalt for our phone batteries. In Mozambique, a modern bridge stands empty while debt grows faster than the economy. In Nigeria, markets drown in plastic shoes and cheap electronics that kill local industry. In Ethiopia, the Omo River no longer flows the way it always did, because its waters have been locked behind concrete walls. These are not isolated incidents. They are not exceptions. They are elements of a larger system in which Africa provides raw materials, space for waste, a market, and a testing field for new solutions, while the profits flow elsewhere, to Beijing, to Dubai, to the world's ports and stock exchanges. Because every cable burned in Agbogbloshie, every lump of cobalt from Congo, every barrel of oil from Nigeria, and every kilowatt of power from Ethiopian dams moves along the same routes. Through the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal, through Middle Eastern ports. That is where Africa and Asia meet. That is where you can see that what happens in Lagos, Maputo, or Katanga directly affects Dubai, Jeddah, or Haifa. This is where the broader notion of the Greater Middle East starts. A region that does not end at Israel or Saudi Arabia, but stretches all the way to Morocco, Sudan, Pakistan. Because this network does not recognize borders. It is a web that wraps around the entire world. And that is why we cannot look at the new Silk Road just as a chain of investments and loans. We have to look at the dark side as well, at the dumps, the artisanal mines, the debts and poisoned rivers, because they are just as real as ports and railways. Africa shows that globalization has a price, and that this price is not paid in Beijing or Brussels, but in Accra, in Katanga, in Lagos, and on the banks of the Omo. And all of these places, though thousands of kilometers apart, come together at one point, on the trade routes that run through the Middle East. So when we close this chapter, we have to remember, Africa is only the beginning. It is a mirror in which we see the future of the entire world. Because if today in Agbogbloshie cables are burning and in Congo children are digging for cobalt, then tomorrow similar stories may unfold in other parts of the Greater Middle East.